Welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, June 14th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Big 12. They're looking for some extra revenue with that gap between them and the Big 10 and SEC, growing even more, and they're looking for that maybe through private equity or maybe through selling their naming rights. So we'll get into all of that today. Then we'll get into a little bit of a past trend around some of the title champions from the past decade or so that Ohio State is not following. So I'll get into that and how it could spell doom for the Buckeyes this upcoming season. Then we'll get into the Big Ten. We'll get into two coordinators in the Big Ten, Tim Lester and DeAnton Lynn, two very, very important people that could totally shape the conference this upcoming year. So I want to break down them for 1 second and how they could have a huge effect on their teams. Then we'll get into some Group of 5 Cinderellas. We've been through all of the Power 4 conferences. Now we'll get to some Group of 5 teams that I'm watching especially closely. And then we'll finish it off with some Tommy's guys of 2024. I'm going to give you some guys that I'm watching very, very closely going into this season that I really expect to kind of blow up this season. So we'll get into that at the end of the show. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's start talking about this Big 12 private equity deal that could be going down here pretty soon, and it's definitely a very interesting one. We've talked about kind of the gap that has been forming between the SEC, the Big 10, and the Big 12 and the ACC. And the ACC and Big 12 have obviously been looking for different ways to kind of close that gap, and the Big 12 just, I believe yesterday was when this was broke, that they're looking in the direction of private equity possibly for the future of their conference, for just kind of closing that gap a little bit. And they're looking in the way of CVC Capital Partners, a company that has a lot of investments in different professional leagues around the world, in the world of sports, and it's about going to be around $800 million to $1 billion for 15 to 20% of the Big 12 moving forward, which would be quite the thing. It's the first time that has happened. It definitely would be a very interesting thing to watch and has a lot of implications for college football and for college sports overall, to be totally honest with you. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch this. CVC is a very, very huge private equity company. They hold about $200 billion in investments around the world, and a lot of different ones within the world of sports, all professional teams at this point. So this would be the first time they're getting into the college sports world, and it would be very interesting to watch, definitely. The Big 12 is currently making about $31.7 million from their deals with Fox and ESPN, while the SEC and the Big 10 are making around 75. At least the Big 10 is making around 75 this upcoming year. So that gap is huge. There's no two ways about that, and you do have to close it somehow. But this is a really sketchy way to close it. I'll be totally honest with you. It's one of those things that I've been a little bit worried about as we've gotten kind of further down this road. The money part of it is going to be a huge conversation, and it kind of has to be in some of these athletic departments around the country, but this is a very dangerous proposition, and I think that's why there are a lot of Big 12 presidents that weren't necessarily too excited about this idea. There have been reports that they're pushing back pretty heavily on this, and I think it makes sense. There's going to be some things that happen from this that could be a little bit dangerous. And, you never really know what these investment groups are, looking for when they get into different kind of worlds like college sports. But the reality is they like to turn a little bit of a profit. That's just the way that these companies work. That's what they're made to do. So I think there could come a reality where the Big 12 is, rolling merrily along for a couple of years, and this seems like a very good partnership, and then they come to the table one day, and whoever's, the representative for CVC or whatever that looks like is going to come into that room and say, volleyball doesn't make quite enough money. Maybe we should move on from volleyball and really push more resources towards football and basketball, because that's probably the good business decision, right? But that's not what college sports is about. College sports has always been about kind of spreading out opportunities and spreading out different resources to all of the teams you can. Obviously, a lot of it goes towards football and basketball. There's no secret about that. But the reality is there is a, I suppose there's a little bit of a beauty to college sports kind of foregoing some of the technical monetary gain they could make by keeping some of these sports alive. And that's kind of the goal of what college sports should be. And if you introduce an entirely new entity, especially in a time that is very weird and all over the place and no one really has a lot of answers, they're going to have a different way of doing things. And they might not care about the sport as much as some other people in that room do. And they might not understand the sport as much as some other people might. And that's a huge thing. It just has to be a huge part of this conversation where we can't, just invite people into the room because they have the money that you need. And I fully understand that's going to be a problem going forward. And the Big 12 does have to worry about that. And Brett Yormark does have to worry about that. And he is a businessman, if nothing else. So I don't necessarily think it's, an indictment on him or an indictment on the league overall. I just more think it's dangerous. I think you're putting your league, you're putting your conference in a position where you're adding voices to the room that don't fully understand what they're dealing with. Now, they could, understand it better than I'm giving them credit for, to be totally fair. They have been in sports for quite some time and fully understand what the world looks like, but college sports is really different than what professional sports is. And now the lines have kind of been blurred over the last couple of years, but the reality is there is a difference, and there needs to be people in that room that are making those decisions that understand what that difference is. And I'm not super confident that these private equity firms fully understand that. Now, I do think there are enough people in these rooms to where I think they'll be able to be forthright and say, this is not the right way to go, or, maybe this isn't the way that we want to do things, whatever that looks like. I do think there's enough of those people, but those people also don't write the checks all that often. So it's one of those conversations where I understand you're trying to get yourself out of a little bit of a hole, and you're trying to kind of limit the gap between you and the SEC and the Big Ten and everyone else around you. But the reality is you're doing it in a way that almost opens you up to way more negative impacts down the road, where, yeah, you're getting a big time cash infusion, and that is very, very helpful to what you're going to do in the next couple of years with all the bills that are going to be due in the next couple of years. But the reality is you still got to make that money back. You still have to make that money, and you're doing it by only getting 80% of what your conference brings in, because 20 is going to this company that just gave you a ton of money up front. And I promise you they would make their money back relatively quickly. The question is, would the Big 12 be able to make up the difference of what that 20% is? So all of this kind of push for this arms race, I suppose, around who has the most dollars and who has the biggest media deal and who has the best NIL collectives and whatever it is, all of that has kind of created this need for money, and this need for money at this very moment. Everyone needs it right now, and if they don't have it right now, they might not be able to compete in 5 years, in 10 years. So I think it's almost caused some people to, I don't want to say panic, but push things forward a little bit faster than they would want to. I think Brett Yormark fully understands what he's doing. He's a fantastic businessman. That's where he came from, kind of the world of sports media and television. And so he fully understands these conversations and what it takes to kind of deal with these and move forward. But the reality is this is a very dangerous thing you're playing with, where you have a very, very tumultuous time in college sports right now, and there's going to be some people that try to get in and try to make a quick buck or try to make some money off this crazy situation they have in front of them. But you have to make sure you're inviting the right people in the room. Not to say that CVC would not handle this, totally above board and be, a little bit more hands-off in the decision-making and that type of thing. I'm not necessarily saying they would be, totally in and messing everything up. But it's just to say you're adding more variables to the conversation. You're adding more people to the room that haven't been there in the past. And frankly, there's a reason that they haven't been there in the past. So it's one of those things that I think all of us have been a little bit worried about. There's tons of bills that are going to have to be paid over the next couple of months, over the next years, and you got to get that money somehow. And there's some interesting entities that are willing to give you that money, but want some things in return, like 20% of your league going forward, or some decision-making powers, or whatever it is. So it's one of those things that maybe it doesn't hurt, in the next year or so. Maybe it doesn't hurt in the next 2 years, but I think it could in 5 or 10 when kind of all of this stuff really starts to sit into place. And maybe, people want to be more competitive in football. Maybe people want to be more competitive in college basketball, and that comes at the expense of other sports. Or, maybe it comes at the expense of some of the academic resources that they put forward. So it's not ideal. I don't think this is something that a lot of people, frankly, within the Big 12 are too excited about, if I'm being totally honest. But I'm definitely not. I think college sports for the last little bit has been in a very, very weird state, and we officially made that big leap to kind of get a revenue sharing agreement in place, and I think that was a great leap to take. But it added a lot of more questions, and with questions, with confusion comes an ability to make some money in that process. So I just think we have to be very careful about the people that we invite into the sport, the people that we let have any remote say in the sport, because it could not be great. There are other private equity firms that are looking into this. Redbird Capital is a huge one. I believe Weatherford Capital is the other one. Drew Weatherford was a former Florida State quarterback that has been kind of leading the charge in this. So it's probably not going anywhere, if I'm being totally honest. It's not necessarily my favorite thing in the world. I think it's a very dangerous proposition, but also I do think if you have the right people in that room, if you have people that, value education and value the other sports and value what college sports is all about, I think you're going to be okay. It's just adding more voices to that room, and especially voices that aren't in college sports. It's a dangerous game, and I don't necessarily love it, but I think that's kind of the reality we're living in. Florida State's really looking into it. The ACC, I'm sure, is looking into it. So I don't really know what to do about it, if I'm being totally honest. I hope it doesn't, really affect the future of college sports and what they are, but you never really know. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch all of this unfold. I think the Big 12 has gotten some pushback from some presidents and some ADs, so maybe they don't go through with this, but they need the money to keep up somehow. So it'll be really interesting to see how this goes down, and it'll be really fascinating to see if it does go down, how it kind of affects these this league and these athletic programs going forward. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Ohio State. We're going to talk about a trend that has happened with some championship teams in the past, and how Ohio State is not necessarily following that trend. So for a season that a lot have dubbed championship or bust for the Buckeyes, might just be bust, but we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.